Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. Today's episode is part 2 of a 2-part interview in which I'm talking to John Leibee about his novel in the Chronicles of the Human Sphere series, Airaghardt.
Welcome to the Winged Hussar Pubcast. From fantasy to sci-fi to history and horror, your hosts are about to take you on a journey through all things Winged Hussar publishing. Sit back and relax as we talk about writing, gaming, as well as interview some of your favorite authors. Let's wing it.
Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Brandon. For once, not joined by my co-host, Mark, who is being currently replaced by a smoke grenade in today's episode. And we are rejoined by John.
Howdy, howdy. I'm John Leibee.
All right, as I said, this is part 2 of the interview. So as is normal with our author interviews, expect spoilers in this part. You have been warned. If you've not read the book yet, please go do so and come on back. Or if you're a spoiler fanatic like myself and you want to know spoilers before you read it to really see if this book is for you, please feel free to listen on. So first off, to recap what I said in the last episode, for those that don't know, the Chronicles of the Human Sphere series that we produce is set in the world of Infinity the Game by Corvus Belli. Infinity is a sci-fi skirmish game with all the caveats of advanced technology. You have some armies with more than others, and there are some that have practically none. One of which, the Ariadnans, is, an army that John focuses on, is a crux of this novel. But there's still, in Infinity, an omniscient AI that can be good or bad depending on your faction and your views. And the lead character, Will, finds out what happens when he doesn't have all the caveats of being part of the most technologically advanced group, faction, whatever you want to call it.
The hyperpower.
Yes. John, you and Mark both share Pan-Oceania protagonists. But who they are, what they symbolize, could not be more different. While Mark's whole novel is about protecting, the people, and the Pan-Oceanians, thinking that the Pan-Oceanians are the good guys, Will is adamant about believing Pano is right, but comes to a very different conclusion. Can you talk about your idea for Will and what was your mind frame about having him, in the end, reject everything that Pano offered him and, reject everything he was trying to get to throughout the whole story?
First off, this is the first time I've gotten to talk about spoilers for my book, so I'm very excited because I no longer have to kind of tiptoe about everything. So there's going to be a lot of spoilers. Anyways.
Feel free to unload, man.
So from jump, it was so important to make sure that Mark and I's 2 Pano leads were as different as possible. In the first draft that Mark read, Will was like a anti-theist even. And I eased off on that in favor of slimming his characterization, but the stance remained as different as possible. So where Kyle grew up in with a nice family and he had opportunity, Will was an A-Tech who grew up in a techno favela with a schizophrenic mother and only joined the Fusiliers because of a clerical error. Kyle has everything he wants from Pano. And while they messed with him a little bit during the events of Downfall, he's still a true believer. And Gabriel de Fearson takes care of him at the end of the novel. Even signs off on him and Lisette in the end. But Will just isn't. He doesn't want to see the big picture because he cares too much about the small one. And when one of his mistakes has him take the fall so that Aleph doesn't get scandalized, that sense of alienation grows and grows and grows. And it isn't until he sees life from a different planet that he realizes maybe he doesn't need to be the good soldier to people who don't care about him. And it's not like Will knows that's happening. He spends half the novel thinking he's going to go stomp out the Shasvasti in the DRC-9, the Dark 9, and get his Aquila Guard status back. But it's only once he goes into battle with the MacArthurs and gets to know them that he realizes he wants to stay on Dawn. He doesn't want to go back to his cold corporate military job. And that kind of choice, what you want versus what you need, I think makes for some of the most compelling narratives. And then, there's the whole romance with Saoirse that seals the deal for him. She likes him for him, to quote a pop song, and, he's an outcast like her, She doesn't like him because what he does for her or, what role he performs in society. And coming from a world coming from the hyperpower where your social media is you. That kind of transparency and honesty is something that's like so rare that you can't just give it up. Like, in the end, I think that Kyle's arc is about being the best person you can be, even when the circumstances become impossible. But Will's arc is about becoming the best version of yourself. Kyle is basically figured himself out. All he has to do is learn to act in accordance to his morals and keep the path. You know, he has to continue forward and everything will work out right for him. And that's basically what he does throughout the events of Downfall, is he just keeps his faith and he keeps moving forward. But like, Will is so lost at the start of the book that he lies to himself in internal narration even. And making sure that those characters were so set apart that it's difficult to imagine Will and Kyle like being friends, like people might like try to fanfic or something like that, was like integral. I wanted to make sure that you knew that if Kyle and Will met, they would hate each other.
Yeah, and that's interesting, and that's something that we really haven't seen too much in our fiction, is a character changing sides. I mean, I'll use fantasy as an example because that's the thing that I'm the most comfortable with. You can't really have, so with Kings of War, you couldn't have like a Basilean who is the, like, you know, fantasy holy knight. You wouldn't see them necessarily switch sides to be with like the goblins or an orc. Like it's hard to mentally jump the hoops to get them to do that. But with this game, where most of pretty much all the factions are human of some sort, the humanoids, like it's more believable to see. Again, like you said in the first episode, this whole game is based specifically on like historical significance, and you know, there's historical characters and you have real world representation. So it is something that is plausible and you can totally get away with and totally see. So when one of the things that people have said to us in the past is, I want to see more villain representation, or, you know, this while he's not a villain, he betrays his faction. And it's one of those things that it's a different viewpoint than what we've done and what we've seen so far. And I think that's what makes this novel so unique. It's a rejection of the quote unquote faction he's supposed to be representing in a game standpoint, and it transcends being a game novel to be a science fiction novel in general, because he switches factions, which is not something that you can really do in the game. And you correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think you can run Pano with an Ariadne in the army as just a single unit like that, can you?
In no way. No, some of the armies have units from other factions because those units are kind of like hired out to them as mercenaries. Like you might see like an alguacil in I always want to say it in French, but I'm going to stop myself. The Rapid Response Force, the Merovingian, the French army. You might see an alguacil there, or you might see like a Gulam and like this kind of army, but you don't see like a Pano-Shanian kicking around with an Ariadne, and that's just something that doesn't really happen. No, so you're absolutely correct there.
Yeah, and even over the course of the novel, I love the cover art where Will's in his full gear, and it really looks cool. And I was kind of hoping that at the end he would have most of his armor still, but I think he loses. Does he still have the helmet at the end, or does he lose all of the armor? Because at that point, if he loses all the armor, then it's relatively easy enough to make a Will model a part of the army. But I think that's like the peak point of where you blur the line between this is a book based off of a tabletop game, but it transcends that and actually is great as a standalone novel, even outside of the game, because you blur those lines of what is game material and what is novel material.
Thank you very much for the compliments. I appreciate them very much. And yes, absolutely. Like at the end of everything, Will's lost all the trappings of what makes him Pano-Shanian. He no longer has a cube. He no longer has his armor. His Geist has been set into silent for almost a year, and he has fully converted to being a person who is Ariadnan, is because those are the people who his heart really lies with. They have the same goals as him. They have the same priorities. They're his people, his tribe. And he doesn't want to go back to Pano-Shania at all. And he's comfortable living forever with the MacArthurs.
And that ending, I think that's something I want to talk about a little later in the episode, but that ending is suffice. And with people who, in a setting, just writing in general, where people want to continuously have sequels, and I'm a slave to that as well. I love sequels. You kind of capitulate that ending as just like the story is succinct in itself. And we'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's another kudos to you. One of the things that, if you haven't heard the past few episodes, and in general for other people who haven't heard the past episodes, I like to compliment our authors because, they deserve compliments. So you're going to hear all these, you've done a great job. And I speak from the heart when I say that. I don't say that just because you write for us. I all the authors that we publish, I go to bat for because I believe in their writing talent. I don't sign people. I don't put novels to print that I am not happy with the final result on. So again, I like to highlight the things that I really feel like the author has done well. Mostly also because, when we do these editings back and forth, there's not necessarily the time and space for me to be commenting on every single thing, saying, good job at this, good job at this. I try to highlight where I can in the editing, but where my primary job when we're doing this is to get the novel to print however we can do it. So this is my area as well to say, these are the things I really loved about your novel if I didn't say it enough in the editing process. And continuing on with that line of thought, is one thing you've done really well is point of view. We mentioned it in the first episode about how you only had one point of view, and that was, maybe we didn't mention it. If we didn't mention it, disregard that last thing. But, you kept one point of view character throughout the novel, and that was Will. And some people struggle with point of view because they want to make sure that the audience knows exactly what's going on at all times. I mean, some people would argue that one single point of view gets boring because you're continuously stuck in one person and you don't get to see a range of other characters. But with this novel, it really benefited from having a single point of view. And as a reader, I wasn't left wanting. You were consistent in your approach of how Will viewed things. One of the things that I really took away from your writing that I don't see a lot of other authors do is you have the rule of fast action is supposed to be fast. In your narration isn't supposed to be long drawn out when something quick and explosive is happening. You want it to be quick. And I think that's a really strong point that other authors, again, if you're listening to this for writing tips, that's what other authors should take away from is fast action should be fast. Thank you for that statement because I'm going to keep using that as much as I possibly can in other people's writing. What went into your head when writing his point of view to making sure that, Will was always the point of view character, making sure that all of your narration was uniform of keeping that point of view?
So, the most important thing to me, especially when writing a book where the character is the stranger in a strange land, is that the moment that I jump to another character's point of view, I take away the possibility for there to be things like uncertainty, for there to be questions you might have, to give you more understanding about these side characters is to subtract from the main character's experience. And I wanted you as the reader to be stuck, like you said, in Will's shoes the entire book, and to feel like how Will feels when he is stuck in Caledonia. And so we talked about in part when we talked about the Scots Gaelic, and until the epilogue where it is obvious that Will has been learning Gaelic so that he can talk with Saoirse, nothing any of the Caledonians say in Gaelic is translated in the prose. You can never be sure if someone's mocking Will. You can't be sure if they're lying to him or speaking badly around him behind his back. There are portions, of course, where it's more obvious, and I kind of play it for humor. Like when Finley tells Hodges that Will's going to die climbing the mountains between the Broom and Fort Resolute. Saoirse plays it off like nothing. But telling you all of that up front would just serve such a disservice to the fact that there's a compliment I can pay to you as the reader for being astute enough to pay attention to the body language that Finley presents, the body language that Saoirse presents, and finding the humor in the fact that Finley is just very open with the fact that Will die because he kind of considers him kind of the weakest link in their chain. keeping that pressure, keeping that alienation, keeping it all strong also keeps you in like Will's point of view as a person who's alienated from Pan-Oceania. And so when he starts to like project a lot of his issues out onto the Caledonians, especially in the scene where Saoirse is confronting Will over knowing about the Shasvasti, about going with Alistair and not saying anything to her, despite them spending the night before in a big old bar fight, you can kind of understand Will's viewpoint better than if you knew that, you know, this thing was happening, that thing was happening, and you had a better, more complete understanding of Caledonia. You might go, you're making some weird jumps here, buddy. You're being a little bit on edge. Instead, because you're kept in his viewpoint, maybe you feel frustrated with how the Caledonians have been as well. Maybe you're annoyed, or maybe you don't trust them. And so that can kind of increase the amount of bleed, the amount of immersion between the character and you, the reader. And yeah, on the topic of like fast things have to happen fast. I have a pet peeve about writing. The pet peeve is when people use things like out of nowhere or the word suddenly, because in writing, everything is suddenly. Every single thing on the page is suddenly, because if it wasn't suddenly, then there'd be like, I don't know, like highlighter scratched across it. It'd be like House of Leaves or something. It'd be in blue text, so you know that you're about to run into Johnny Truant's like narration in Courier New or whatever. Everything is suddenly. You don't have to do suddenly. And so like fast things being fast, absolutely. The longer that a reader spends on a sentence, listening to it be written out, listening to every comma splice and going through the lists or like the long diatribes and like side tricks and other such things, the slower something happens, as opposed to fast. It's just language.
That's true. And just in general, I think I've mentioned before on the show that I am not a huge fan of Stephen King's on writing. I think that there were things I agreed with him, and there were things I didn't agree with him. And clearly he knows what he's talking about because he's, you know, written so many books. But that doesn't mean I have to agree with the style. But one thing I always took away and tried to do in my work, but haven't always succeeded, is he said, you can write a novel, short story, or anything without an adverb. And words that end with ly, usually you can omit it and the sentence reads perfectly fine without. And that suddenly reference, the very poignant fact to that is if you remove suddenly from the sentence, it still reads perfectly fine. If you just have to, and if you're trying to go for something in specific that's the reason why you're using it, you can do that more with context clues. And I think that's something that we talked about last time with Finley's not speaking the same language as Will. Context clues. You know, you want to show the reader what you're trying to do with context. You don't want to tell them and beat them over the head with suddenly, things like that. You want to show them through your narration, your prose.
Exactly. And on the topic of adverbs, I think the adverbs on occasion are actually very good. And the way that you would use an adverb is to indicate that whatever word that you're using, the tone or maybe the implication of it is actually the opposite. So like, if a character smiles happily, that's super redundant. That's very bad. A lot of people want to use adverbs like that. And so they'll have characters like frown sadly, or they'll have them like yell loudly or something like that. All of that's just go straight into the recycling bin. Don't do any of that stuff. But if you have a character smile sadly, that's when the adverb is like load bearing, you know, like it can really go pound for big descriptions, to just have something small and truncated so that the reader can engage with that mentally and decide what's in their mental theater in that moment when they read something like smiled sadly, or like frowned proudly, or like yelled softly. And there's some weirdness, like yelled softly is something I probably wouldn't put into a book, but it might stop you and have you look at it for more than a second. Hopefully not too long. The goal is to keep you in the book, to keep you immersed, to make you not realize that you're reading a book. Like the worst experiences I've ever had reading books, being in theaters, anything, are the moment that something happens and you sit back and you go, I am in a movie theater. I am reading a book. You know, because you go pages and pages and pages and pages, and then all of a sudden, like you hit like a word you don't know, and then you pause and you're just like, I am reading a book. And that's something you never want to have happen as an author, is to get someone in that moment like that. And sometimes, like, Stephen King says, adverbs will absolutely kick someone into that mode where they go, really? Smiled happily? And then you're done for.
Absolutely. You bring up a great point, and I've seen that before where people use the adverbs where they shouldn't, and you have to really give consideration to what you're modifying. But let's backtrack a bit. When I was editing the book, one of the things that we went back and forth on was there were certain things I wanted to modify, and you said, well, I don't know if that's necessarily the case because Will, remember, Will's not the smartest person in the world. So I said, okay, with all this editing process, there's always the conversation, the dialogue that between editor and author, and we had some conversation about keeping the narration a certain way because that's Will's intellect. Do you want to comment on that?
I would love to. Will as a character is not a very educated character. When we talk about voice, especially in prose, the really close third-person limited perspective means that we are inside of Will's head all the time. And so listening to the spoiler episode, you probably noticed that one of the techniques that I use pretty often is really short, truncated sentences. Sometimes I use colloquialisms or smaller words actually in the narration itself, or something bigger might be more appropriate. That kind of stuff is super duper important in making sure that you as the reader can kind of get into Will the character and know that he is he's kind of low key extremely smart, but he's very much not been gifted with any sort of powerful education. He's super analytical, he's fast on the uptake. He has a memory that's bordering on eidetic, but because of where he grew up, he's never given the opportunities that other people were. And it's not like he knows that he's very smart either. He kind of underestimates himself pretty consistently, this is the spoiler episode. I can talk about all the spoilers, which is the big difference between Odun and Will inside the core of their being. Throughout the novel, I constantly set up how Odun is this kind of mastermind, this genius, this guy who really goes above and beyond in a lot of his ploys and his trickery, his very subtle machinations, things like that. And a lot of it comes from Will's point of view, where Will thinks of himself as not really a smart guy, just a capable guy. And Odun is obviously very, very smart. As Gavin forced, he beat Will up and down the block at chess every time. And you only really see little snippets of things that really lend toward the fact that maybe he wasn't that bad if he could bring him to a draw. So Will is very smart and thinks he's dumb. Odun, I think, the way that I characterized him, Odun is kind of dumb, but is convinced he's the smartest person in the room at all times. It's things even coming down to words that he uses incorrectly, or decisions that he makes because he underestimates everyone around him. Meanwhile, Will is overestimating everyone else. And I feel that's kind of, in many ways, the key to his success as a character is that he thinks everyone is better than him and he plans accordingly, and they're not. And it makes it kind of easy. The things that hold Will back, his trauma, his mom, the incident on Svalorheima, his secondhand cube, his childhood in the techno favela of Kingsden, surrounded by gang violence and Atex and Submondo and all these bad stuff, means that him as a character in his narration, he's more prone to things like ruminating on bad things that have happened to him, feeling like he might have deserved them. He gets really in his head about the decisions that he makes. When things annoy him, violence is his first response, and it's something that he pushes against constantly throughout the book because he doesn't want to be the guy who starts swinging right away, but he would like to be. And those flaws shore up, they support all the virtues that he shows. He shows kindness to people he believes are lesser than him. He has a certain kind of selflessness when it comes to what he can do to help others. When he decides to go with Saoirse on the scouting thing at this hot spring instead of staying behind and resting and letting Dunn do it. He has a certain kind of suicidal bravery. He refuses to let other people get shoved around, like what happens with Nora in the garage. And like when those choices backfire, when like Nora jumps him after he helps her, like I think that makes him kind of likable, even though some of his narration is a little truncated, even though he has kind of a very black and white view of the world at certain points, even though he has this kind of fatalistic edge to a lot of the stuff that he does. And then one thing that I wanted to mention was that due to the cube incident before, there is this particular aspect of his characterization that actually gave me a lot of trouble, and it's that Will doesn't feel pain like other people. Like, he's had it so bad that nothing can like really compare to that. And if you listen to part 1, where I talk about fortitude, I feel like that's Will's primary virtue. This is a character that gets knocked down and always gets back up, no matter how many times he starts falling to pieces, no matter how much blood he loses. He would rather die standing than lay down for even a second. There were so many points in the book where I had him like flinch or gasp or react to what had just happened to him, where on a reread I had to stop and go, okay, that's normal to someone who isn't Will, but it isn't Will. This injury would like put someone down for days, but I'm pretty sure that Will's going to choose to limp on his dislocated knee because he just doesn't understand what it means to quit. Like, he's going to put his arm that's set on fire out in a puddle, and he's not going to worry about it for the rest of narration. Like, it's not going to get brought up again, even though it probably hurts, because Will thinks that pain isn't pain. You know, he gets his nose broken and then he gets directly into a fist fight with a bunch of people. That's the kind of stuff that could kill you. But for Will, he doesn't really seem to notice, doesn't really seem to care. And making sure that I nailed that characterization time and time again, instead of, you know, having him, you know, seethe on the ground for over like getting his shin knocked on occasion. I say that, but this is, like I said, stuff like having his knee dislocated or having a giant worm monster burn brands into his arm. That kind of stuff was difficult.
Absolutely. And, you know, the tough thing is, I think people who are reading the novel without really understanding character, and that's something that I see happen a lot. It's amazing how we can get like a lot of 5-star feedback on a novel, and then you get a 2-star, 1-star feedback that says, "Oh, the characters are insufferable." It's like, did you understand the whole point of the novel? Like, I don't think you really fully grasp it. Or somebody will say something like, the characters were weak. I think this is why, one of the other reasons why I really wanted to do this podcast is because I think somebody who's reading the novel and just not really fully understanding who Will is might say, oh, he's got plot armor left and right. But I didn't, as the editor and as a reader, I didn't see it that way. I think your reiteration of pain is not pain, and knowing what, especially on a second read through, you read through that book on a second read through, it's a completely different take on everything. You really see why things happen the way they happen. And I think this podcast is a great way for you to make sure people really understand that fact, if they didn't upon a read through, is that is why he reacts the way he reacts to pain. So I think great job with that. Like I said, on a second read through, you really can see that brought clearly.
Thank you. Yep. One of the big lessons I took from failing at writing my first book, which I've been told is enjoyable, but I haven't looked at because doing so would acknowledge it. Since like, I don't know, like early 2020. One of the things I learned writing that is that people love questions that don't get answered, that you can really like put off telling someone the reason for something, as long as you promise them, you know, that you'll eventually tell them. We talked about this in part 1 as well. When a reader trusts you to answer a question, they will go a long time before it's answered if they need to, especially if it's a big question or if it gets referred back to. As long as when the little questions show up, you're not really taking your time with them, you know? So like, on the aspect of like making enjoyable on a second read through, that's something that honestly made me really happy to hear, because it means that I was able to bring you first through the first read through of the novel, where all these questions and their answers were spaced apart so well that on the second read through, it doesn't feel like the same book. You have knowledge now that changes the context of things, and things aren't like spoon-fed to you. So as you're reading, you feels like you're in on a secret. And that's, if you're listening to this for writing advice, as Brandon likes to say, if you let your reader feel like they are in on a secret, like if they figure out the twist in your book before it happens, perfect, good. They feel smart now. They probably feel really, really good about themselves because they know something that they feel like they shouldn't know. That kind of stuff, paying a compliment to your reader, going, you're a very smart person. This is very smart. This is good. How do you feel about it? It's never going to be bad. I was too smart I was too smart and I figured out your twist, you know? No one's ever going to be like, man, I wish I didn't know that this spoiler was a spoiler. I was about to spoil a movie that's probably 30 years old. I don't know why I stopped myself. But people are always like, I outsmarted the author. This idiot, this twist I could see it coming from a mile away. And you know what? Doesn't feel good to hear. But that's exactly what you want your reader to feel. You want them to feel like they outsmarted you. And so, well, I don't know. I feel like that kind of speaks for itself, and knowing that like you got a lot out of the second read through still is perfect. Just the kind of stuff I like to hear.
Good. I'm glad. Speaking of, figuring out the plot and et cetera, there were a couple shock moments that I think on a first read, I didn't necessarily get, and then again, on the second read, I felt like, oh man, you set this up so well. This was so well done. I sort of had a feeling about O'Doone being the big villain, but then when the pieces started, no pun on the chess pieces, but when the pieces started coming together, I thought it was a great payoff, especially when they're in their bunker there and he's talking, he puts all the pieces together and he's like, oh, dude, I'm going to kill you. I was like, oh, that's so good. That's so good. So there were two major shock moments, technically three. The Svartalheima, again, sorry if I butchered that incident, which sets up for the final book, and the twist of O'Doone. And then the whole implanting of the cube that plays out while he's getting tortured that you've subtly referenced countless times with the pain, not pain thing. Those were like the key like plot twists that I think the readers have to try to figure out. And like I said, I sort of figured bits of it out, but not the entirety of it. But you read things over the years about authors not wanting to kill characters, and I remember reading, nowadays she's not the media sweetheart she once was, but I remember reading that J.K. Rowling cried when she killed certain characters, and as an author, I was just like, now grow up. Then why are you killing them if it makes you cry? Like, don't do it then. But, authors have a hard time making characters suffer, depending on if they like them or not. But you went all in on Will, and I think that his suffering and his torture makes it stronger. Was it hard to write? Like, were you at any point like, I don't want to do this to Will, I like him too much, or like, do I really want to make him suffer that bad? Especially like at the end, we tweaked the ending, because I was like, let's not have his leg be, I think, permanently broken was what we originally said, and then you tweaked it so it wasn't permanently broken. Was there ever any point that you were just like, I don't know, I don't want to do that to Will?
Like, I feel like there is a specific kind of subset to this where it's like, death is not the worst thing that could happen to a character in a book. Because if a character dies, then they are free from whatever bad thing might have happened to them. If a character lives through that bad thing, it can be so much worse. And so I feel like killing characters, like I've done the same thing as J.K. Rowling. I cried while I killed characters. It's not because I felt bad about it. It's because I just was really into that moment where this character's arc comes to this like abrupt and really apropos closure. Like Colin's death in the bunker is, I think, like, I really enjoy that. That's based off of an actual experience that I had playing Infinity. And so thinking about it even now gets me like kind of like amped up. In the moment though, I was, to really show my age, it was like very manly tears, being like, hell yeah, man, fucking get him. As far as like this Svartalheima stuff, like going through the stuff that happened to him, I really feel like that present tense recap of the Svalbardheimer incident was like one of the most contentious parts of the book for the people who read it before. They like didn't really like the idea that I was just changing tenses, because I wanted to push the idea that he's like watching this video and he's having this traumatic flashback. Like he's literally transferred to present tense to show that he has gone from a person in like now and then, or for a person now to going person from then. And like a lot of people wanted like a chapter on it, but like I said before, I don't want to jump around on the timeline. I don't want to go to the Will before. I want to stay in Will's shoes, you know, from chapter 1 into the epilogue. Like I jump back in chapter 0, and that was a choice that I had to make very intentionally to make sure that you knew that this was an action book that has spaceships and werewolves in it. But like, I don't know, doing these bad things to characters is like, it's important to know that there is tension, there's stakes, there's repercussions for a character failing. Because the moment that you're like, oh, that character will never die, I have to kind of hook you on like, well, what do you want to see out of that character? Going back to some of like the J.K. Rowling stuff, it was like talking about like the main character, Harry Potter. At like a certain point in that last book, you know, he could have just died and not a lot would have changed. And at that point, what are you reading for? You're reading just to see the ending to like the series as a whole. You're not really caring so much about how the character ends up, perhaps, but you just want to see how things shake out. And I really wanted to avoid that feeling. I wanted you to feel like Will's not going to die. Obviously, the whole book is from his point of view, but like, how much worse can it get for him? Can this be one-upped? Can this go darker? Like, the torture scene was originally like 5,000 times worse, but then I pulled back on it after the first beta reader complained, and then I pulled back on it again after another reader complained, and then you had me, like you said, pull back again during editing, which I kind of begrudgingly did, but like now looking back on the book as a whole, I know that that's just a stronger decision because it doesn't devolve into this like really terrible like fever dream of all my memories of reading Behemoth by Peter Watts, and like all that stuff just didn't go over well, and I'm really glad that I made those edits. And as a side note, several of my beta readers that I've mentioned by now, just saying beta readers, several of them die on Svalbardheimer. Many of the characters in Will's squadron are named after those particular people, and it was like my original way to give them a shout out while I was writing. And if any of you guys are listening, thank you again. Madison, Ben, I owe you everything.
That's great. That's great. I mean, the torture thing was tough because, and even just the tone, you know, you have to set, the tone has to be appropriate for what you're doing. And, you know, you and I talked about language and, you know, the Infinity, and I've mentioned this in other episodes, but the language in the Infinity book was a lot higher than, when I say higher, I mean a lot stronger than what our books usually entail. So it's trying to find that mix of, well, this is appropriate for the game, but not really appropriate for us. So, you know, we cut down a lot of swears. You sent me a Word doc of all the swears you cut out, and it was like, wow, that's interesting. It was one of the most interesting, like, pieces of data that I've ever seen. I really appreciate you doing that. And so the torture scene was kind of in the same vein of, like, I get where you're going, and I think it was very painful as a reader to read, not as in like painful as, oh, I'm dragging my feet to finish it. Painful as in like, oh, I'm squirming reading this. Maybe we should take it down just a little bit. So all in all, you know, it really added to his character. And then there was a certain scene where Saoirse's finger gets thrown, and I'm just like, oh, I don't know where this is going to go. Part of me was like, oh, that could be real. And then the other part of me is like, no, John wouldn't do that, would he? Like, the implications are pretty intense. I'm like, oh, he wouldn't do that. But you had me on the edge of my seat with that one, like, oof. Let me see where this goes.
They had, like, to sell the idea that Odun has Saoirse and has gone and done something to her to really, like, push how, like, pointlessly petty that he can be, I had to make you like kind of prime you, the reader, to not be sure whether or not I had gone that far. Like, ultimately, I didn't, because I feel like there's a certain level of like gratuitousness and violence that can easily be surpassed. But like, I really wanted in that moment for you to feel like that. Like, oh, did he do that? Did he not? Because again, you're in Will's headspace where he doesn't know what's real, doesn't know what's going on anymore. And like, it's really cool hearing you talk about this, because it's like fist pump moments for me. I'm like, it's like success. Yes, I did that thing correctly because you felt exactly how I wanted you to feel. Awesome. Okay. And then you'll tell me like another little thing. It's like, yes, awesome, cool. So really glad to hear that.
Awesome. I'm glad. Before I want to talk about some of the other characters now, but before we do that, I just want to drop our sponsor real quick. Today's episode is sponsored by On Military Matters, your source for new, used, and out-of-print books on military history, wargaming, and modeling. Check them out at onmilitarymatters.com and make sure to sign up for the weekly e-flyer. So you've got a lot of characters that are deep and just they're so three-dimensional, and that's like one of the things I really enjoy with any of our authors. Mark is always our king of 3D characters, of just depth and just life to them. And you've done a fantastic job with that with yours. So there's a lot of characters, and we could spend time talking about every single one of them, honestly. But I'm going to just pick my 3 favorites. And if you want to come back on and talk about some more, we're more than happy to have you. But the 3 I want to talk about are arguably 3 of the main characters besides Will. The main supporting characters. You've got Saoirse, Gordon, and Nora. I think those 3 characters are essential to Will's characterization and his story. I love Alistair too, but it was a hard choice not including him on this list, because I see Alistair more as the it's hard to put in words, but he's kind of the leader that is there, but he's not as important to Will's story as I feel the other 3 are. I think Will and Alistair learning to trust each other is pivotal, and it's a real great characterization. But I feel like if you were to take out, obviously Saoirse, but if you were to take out Gordon and Nora, I think you would really devolve away from Will's story. So I think those are the 3 I want to talk about today. So let's talk about Saoirse. She's the love interest, the female, Will's female protagonist, the one that we focus on as the feminine sort, even though she's not really feminine. She's an interesting character because she's not your stereotypical polite, meek woman that usually you see a lot of characters have a lot of authors have as their female eyes. She's part animal as part of her species as a wolver, and you see a different sort of feminine perspective than what most modern media includes. But even so, Will falls for her, and it's enough for him to forsake his entire culture and existence with Pan-O. What was the thought going into behind creating Saoirse? Was it to just because she was a wolver, make her as different from like your stereotypical meek, like, oh, help me, a damsel in distress type situation?
Like, it was absolutely when I first pitched the novel, like I really knew that I wanted to chase those Star Trek vibes and have the female wolver as a love interest, just for kind of the novelty of it. And like, there's this pretty loud contingent of online degenerates, of which I am one, who probably go like deer in the headlights at the idea of like a 6-foot tall Scottish gal with washboard abs and a machine gun. So like, there's partially marketing in there as well. Like, look at Karlach from Baldur's Gate 3 and tell me I'm wrong. But like, putting that character to paper, like, I really wanted to show a character who could interact with Will, who was friendly to him, who would challenge him on a lot of his dumb bullshit, and really, like, try to get to know the real him. And I didn't want that character, like you said, to be like the stereotypical, like, kind of cloying romantic interest. Like, Saoirse has some of those traits, of course, because like she is kind of like the counterpart to Will. She depends on him, but I felt really comfortable in kind of getting them to a place where the two of them really depend on each other, and making sure that her flaws, her virtues, her characterization really like shined in the context of the narrative was absolutely super rewarding for me. I felt really pleased with how Saoirse as a character ends up. Like, she's kind of like Will's like id in a way. Like, she goes through all these things that are like similar to the things that he went through with her A-Tech upbringing, her dead father, her half-sibling relationship with Alistair, like the culture of Caledonia and its innate racism towards her people. But like, unlike Will, she doesn't let all that heaviness like drag her down. She really embraces it. And in a way, Saoirse, when she first meets Will, she kind of embodies like all these parts about himself that he hates and like refuses to acknowledge, because that's not Pan-Oceanian. And so like over time, as the two of them interact, she's like chipping away at this mask, giving him permission to be himself. And I don't know, like, there are certain scenes, like the scene in the bar where the two of them sit and talk while drinking, and Will, of course, is not used to actual alcohol because he's from Pan-Oceania. He's used to a lot more pleasing things. He's used for a lot more comfort. He's not used to stuff that's probably made in a oil drum barrel out back. And so that kind of juxtaposition showing how Saoirse takes control of the situation, how Saoirse can show all of this like kind of like fortitude, how she's kind of trying to impress him instead of the other way around, was something that I really liked. I feel like there is a lot of media where, you know, guy meets girl and guy pursues girl. And so kind of writing it the opposite, where it was Saoirse kind of pursuing Will from kind of the get-go, and then having him, of course, because Will is Will and very, what's the right word for it? I don't want to say myopic, but he's definitely nearsighted about certain things. Not really sure of whether or not that's actually happening. And like, she's super fun to write. She's like sarcastic as all hell. She like challenges stuff. She never lets the elephant in the room go unpoked. Like, part one, I called her like dumb honest, and like, yeah, absolutely. She's super easy to write. All the words just come right out, like no filter, no stop. There's a line when she confronts Hammer Hand where he's like, "You've wandered long into my abattoir," and she goes, "Abattoir, you go fuck yourself." And that's like basically my favorite line of dialogue in the whole book.
It's clever, I'll give you that. It's great. But she is like, it was one of those things again where when I was editing and I said, you know, we need to cut down the swear words and stuff, but that is who Saoirse is, and she's bluntly honest. And like you said, she doesn't hesitate to poke the elephant in the room. And I think she's a great character in general. And if you were to take her and just have a whole story just about her, I think it would be really fascinating as well. So there's a follow-up idea: is if you were to ever do a sequel to this, flip the lead, make her the lead, and make Will the secondary.
That's actually that's very tempting. One of my beta readers did in fact ask me for a writing exercise where I would do that kind of point of view flip, and she was actually super fun to write as the point of view character. So that's tempting. That's one way to make me do a sequel to this if you really want me to.
Readers, listeners, comment below. Wherever on social media, however you want to engage John, tell him if you want a Saoirse point of view book. I would love to have it. We can talk about that in the future. But I want to switch to another character now. Gordon is probably one of my favorite characters in the book. I always love the idea of somebody who's hard on the main character, but slowly softens to the point where he's like one of the main character's like closest friends or like confidants, and Gordon fulfills that role perfectly to me. There's all the like little niche things about how he's slowly like letting Will in on who he is, and you know, he's when you think that Gordon's gonna be left for dead, he calls Will and he's just like, you know, tell him where I love her, and he's like, to hell with that, we're coming to get you. It just Gordon just embodies the character I really, really love and respect, and I think you've done a great job at just every scene that Gordon's in is gold. There is not a scene that he's in that I'm just like, I even just the characterization when you first meet Gordon, like in my head, I'm like, this is a character I want to remember. And then when he becomes Will's guard, more or less, it gets so good. Every single scene he in is gold. What was your thought behind making him?
So, like, I really wanted Will to be a little bit more mouthy, again, in contrast to Kyle. I wanted him to be like this kind of career soldier who's very by the book, who's very professional, and then like things get a little bit uncomfortable for him and he lashes out. And I needed someone to be there who he could lash out against, who could just respond back and would basically never take any sort of insult from what he says. And so Gordon, the character, was very much this, like, okay, so he's going to be like this, like kind of the straight man. He's going to be pretty laconic, and he's going to play this role in the book. When I wrote their first interaction, basically, where Will says, "You seem like a barrel of laughs," and Gordon says, "Good, you seem like a joke," that instantly wrote the rest of his character for me. I didn't have to do any sort of like thinking on who he was or like his character or like his motives. I just instantly knew from that moment forward, that's exactly Gordon. That's like quintessentially him. He's the person who has stuff hit him and bounces off of him, which I mean is appropriate because he's a dog warrior. He's a unit that's usually used as like the alpha strike, who has all of the hurt piled on them and then spearheads a big offensive move on the other side of the table. So like there were some points where there was like narrative jujitsu, like the very beginning of when they got introduced. Like on my first write through, Gordon and Nora weren't really like a couple. And one of my readers really read into their relationship and was like, oh, it's obvious that these two characters are a couple. They're obviously in love. Like the way that you wrote them absolutely shows that they should be together. And I'm sitting there staring at the pages like, did they get ones that I didn't print? But it was such a good idea that when I did my second draft, I wrote them together. I made sure that they were, because this reader liked it so much. Obviously other people will. And they did. But there's a moment where Will is on the trailhead and Eddard is there and Gordon is there, and, you know, Alistair is coming up and we're getting introduced to him for the first time, where Eddard is like, oh yeah, and he just locked, Nora McDermott into a locker, and rereading that and being like, oh, this is where Gordon, if I was being true to his character, would like break Will's neck. So like having to work around that wasn't super fun. Having to like really like stretch the narrative and jump around as much as possible. I hope no one noticed it on the first read through. If you're reading this for spoilers, you definitely will now, but I don't know. Like a lot of the hazing that they did felt super natural, like on like 7th draft. On like first draft, it was still really getting to where it needed to go, and like fine tuning and all that stuff was really, really important. Like, I don't know, like it's hard to think about like this book, like you said, without Gordon, the character, because he fills such a necessary role of, like you said, not just being Will's like sounding board for a lot of things, but also being like this guy who kind of drags him back and forth through trouble. And a lot of satisfaction for me was found in how I could see those roles reverse throughout the novel. We mentioned Alistair before, how he's kind of left out. Alistair was kind of left out, yeah, because when in the outline, Alistair and Will would have been, BFFs. But like once the words started getting on the pages, it just Gordon. Gordon was obviously Will's choice for like, his buddy, and like a lot of things came about because of that. You see these characters pull each other out of the fire back and forth and back and forth, Gordon saves Will from the Wolvers in the bar, and then Will saves Gordon in Fort Resolute, and then when Gordon rescues Will from O'Doone, it's this really satisfying back and forth, I feel, that felt really, really good once I had actually kind of like mined it out and discovered it.
Just to comment on some of the things you said, I think that you can easily jump over the fact that Gordon didn't wring Will's neck because it's all about interpretation. He could have just not heard it. He could have been holding back because he didn't want to just murder this random person that showed up. He could have already had his suspicions about Eddard. There's reasons why he didn't do it. I definitely believe that. And then as far as Alistair, I think it's better that Alistair wasn't Will's closest confidant, and I think it worked out better for the story. And I think Alistair is a great character that serves his role well, where you get to know Alistair, but you don't get to know him as well as all the other characters. And I think that speaks to him being the leader. I think he works better as a supporting character that you get to know a little bit through the other characters. And I think you've done that well with Gordon and Saoirse and Nora and Neil. They've kind of told Alistair's backstory, and I think that works well as it is. But you mentioned the whole Nora Gordon aspect. I felt like that humanized them so much. Like Will, again, is just dropped into the middle of this thing. And one of the things that you don't really see too often is romance and families, and I don't think it's explored as much in this type of a setting. There's got to be love. There's that. If you're a Metal Gear Solid fan, there's that quote by Otacon of Snake. Do you think love can bloom on the battlefield? There's got to be. There's got to be romance. I think, and I think that I've worked with people in the past that say there's no room for romance in a war novel. I'm like, that's not true. In this situation where they're all the same age, they're young, there's got to be romance of some sort to make it believable and real. And I think that Nora is such a great character. And I think that she's kind of the opposite of Saoirse in the sense of, there you go. There's that mild, blonde, feminine character that's not in your face like pretty, but you get the vibe that she's very dainty, and while she cries and she has moments of self-doubt, she's also very strong. I mean, anything involving her career, which is perfectly characterized, she's just lightning quick to be able to take care of people. And between Will and Gordon and Alistair, especially that part in Alistair where you think, could Alistair die, and she's just lightning quick, just fixes him up because that's who she is. I think she's a warm but strongly written character where you're not falling into any tropes, but she encompasses different human elements. And I think paired with Gordon, paired with the rest of the cast, she is a perfect element that adds into the humanity of it all.
Thank you very much. Again, as this is becoming very commonplace for me to thank you for giving me compliments, I can sense the pattern forming. First off, Metal Gear Solid, absolutely. People who are astute will notice that Robert Hodges, ex-SAS Best of the Best, as I call him in my internal narration when I think of this character every time, Robert Hodges is sporting a foxhound patch on his, I want to say it's his backpack. No, it's not. It's Saoirse has it as a tattoo on her arm. She's got the fox with lightning bolts for feet, which is the original foxhound symbol from, I want to say, the PlayStation 1 Metal Gear Solid. So absolutely. Yep. Right there with you with Metal Gear Solid. It's one of my big inspirations. And as I was writing Airaghardt, especially certain sections where Will is running around Kill Dalton in the dark, hiding from people, I was absolutely listening to specific sections of the Metal Gear Solid 1 soundtrack.
Amazing.
As far as Nora goes, absolutely. Like, something that I see a lot in fiction, especially recent fiction, as diversity becomes more and more important to people, is that there are a lot of people who don't really know how to write strong female characters. Because at the end of the day, when we look at how certain characters come across, we go, okay, so that character's strong, that character's weak. And we take that strong and weak and we kind of rate them on a more masculine scale. We take them a lot more literally. Saoirse, in that regard, is like a strong, in quotation marks, female character. She embodies a lot of masculine traits. Nora, on the other hand, was very intentionally written as a strong female character. I wanted to make a female soldier who did not embody masculine traits, but was still meaningfully contributing to the victory of the MacArthur forces. Like, she's very scared. She really can't fight. But at the end of the day, she's the one who, no hesitation, saves Will from the regenerated Speculo killer. And making sure that Nora was pretty present as kind of almost like as a reminder of like a normal person was also integral in highlighting how, how special, how strong, how brave many of the other characters were. You have that character at baseline, the person who's ostensibly not supposed to be there. And in a lot of ways, I feel like Nora is sticking it out to the end, getting in the fight with the Specular Killer, surviving with Hodges and Saoirse's help, however, but surviving is something that not a lot of characters in Infinity, not a lot of soldiers in Infinity could really ever really aspire to. And so her showing that fortitude, sticking in there, even at the end, moving on to become a 112, she's living her dreams, but she's become, as Will says, a veteran. And I felt like that kind of arc was really satisfying to write. And I'm really glad that I got to tell her story.
Fantastic. And then moving away from original characters, you were able to use a named character. And it's kind of a taboo topic. Some companies want us to, some companies don't. They wanted to just be done with the utmost care because, this is their sandbox and their toys. So we want to make sure, we're not killing characters that they have plans for because it's just silly. But you got to use Joan of Arc, and not just in like a minor cameo, but she had a big impact on Will's story at the very end. How was that like going from gamer to, author of Infinity fluff, and you were able to use a big character that, everybody who plays the game knows? How was that like?
In a word, it was nerve-wracking because it wasn't about just like including Joan of Arc. It was making sure that I put Joan of Arc in this book in a way that I, as a fan, would enjoy, and that I think that everyone else would enjoy, while still sticking true to like all of her different facets as a character. She's like the war goddess of Pan-Oceania. She is a historical person with real life quotes. She is a character that shows like charity and kindness. She is incarnated as a Catholic in the new Infinity lore, and balancing all of that to make sure she embodied all these saintly things and all of her genius that her willpower 12 and inspiring leadership all suggest. It was really, really hard. Like, I had help. One of my beta readers, Airaghardt, is Catholic, and they were able to get me to align a lot of her dialogue and actions with the current catechism. Beyond that, I try to bring across her zealous devotion in equal measure to like her compassion. I tried to make her a little scary. I tried to make her really, really nice. I tried to make when she would switch between Joan of Arc, who would run headlong into gunfire to personally kill every combined soldier who had come down the hall in Strelsau, with Joan of Arc that you see on the poster in the very beginning, who's holding a bunch of children and, trying to advertise the Neo-Terran Integration Fund. And at the end of the day, mostly I just really wanted for her to provide a compelling backdrop for the denouement after the climax. Like, I really wanted something to help you kind of stick in, to help you pay attention. I noticed this is long after I had started and long after this scene had really, like, I don't want to use the word coagulated, but that's the word that's for some reason on the forefront of my mind, so I will. I noticed that Craig Gallant did something very similar with Yelena Kovacs and Cuervo Goldstein in Shell Game, and I feel like it's just I feel like that's a really good way to use a named character. Like, you shouldn't really have them take a bunch of center stage. You shouldn't really have them solve the protagonist's problems for them, but having them show up to talk to the protagonist, having them show up to ground the world in Infinity the game, the world of the novel in Infinity the game is, I think, kind of important. Like, one thing I knew for sure was I didn't want her to like do any fighting. Like, nothing, like I just said, nothing is worse than the named hero showing up and saving the day. So she's like more of a new threat than anything else. And like, that threat comes in the form of her offering Will everything he's ever wanted. The ultimate goal of him, the apex of his redemption arc, come and join Blizzard 6, like, come work for Pan-Oceania, let's kick ass together. And Will turning her down means there's no going back. There is no one higher up in the organization he could say no to. And so it just shows you, the reader, that this is like the ultimate choice that he's making here. He's telling effectively like one of the like the military leaders of Pano to shove it. And, you know, Joan being Joan, she's extremely gracious about it. And that kind of, like you said earlier about like the sequels and stuff, like I really wanted Airaghardt to be one and done. Like I didn't want to have a bunch of stories about Will, because I feel like his story should start and end and have a really concise arc and be as satisfying as possible within that. And so doing all that means, you know, Will can't go back to Pano, but he's like okay with that. He has a new home, he's got a new family, and his redemption in the end doesn't come from rejoining Pano or saving all these people, but it kind of comes from forgiving himself. And like that ties back to the leadership theme from earlier, where it's like all these big guys that Will serves under, they don't really care about the little guys, but Joan makes Will feel like she does. And that's kind of, I feel like, an honest representation of both sides of that argument. Like, ultimately, Will stays with the MacArthur because that's his nature. But if things had changed and he had chosen to go with Joan, I don't think that would be a bad ending for him either.
Yeah, and, you know, it's like I was saying, as you brought up again, most people are just ready for a sequel before they even finish their novel. And everybody likes to see, I mean, if you like what you're reading, you like what you're watching, you want to see more of that character. You know, I'm the type of person where I get sad when the show ends because I'm like, that's it. I want more. I want to see more. I don't want to watch it over again. I want to see more of this character. And I don't know, you get to the point where you beat a dead horse sometimes. I think that's why a lot of media doesn't push for as much sequels anymore, even though people love that. It's a double-headed sword, you know? And your novel ends on a point where it ends happily and the story comes to a close, where even though we can do a Saoirse point of view sequel, it doesn't have to. It doesn't call for it if you don't want to, or if the community doesn't want to, whatever the case may be. It's a good story within itself. But we've talked a lot about characters, and even though that begets a lot of the story, and we've touched on different areas, let's talk about let's kind of end the episode with the book itself. What was your favorite part of writing the book? And in general, what was your favorite part about the whole writing experience, whether writing the book, working with us, working with the other authors in the community? And on the flip side of that, what was the most stressful part of all of this? And what was the part of the book or the writing process you had the hardest time with?
So I think the part that I enjoyed the most were the little bits between story beats on my outline where I got to kind of discovery write. Like sections like their trek through the Highlands were entirely off the cuff, with my only guide being point A and then point B 2,000 words after. So writing all this stuff and then taking it to Ben and Selena and being like, so how much of this is accurate? How much of this is true? Did I really nail it? Did I not? Was my research not good enough? That was really engaging and really, really cool. And like being able to do that for a lot of different scenes, like knowing where the connector points were and getting to like bridge the bones of the story to meet in the middle was just like awesome. One of my most favorite things. Like stuff just like kind of comes from the aether in that regard. Like, and dialogue for sure. Dialogue is 100% also like so enjoyable, and I take a lot of pride in my dialogue, and I really, really enjoy writing it because in certain scenarios it's like channeling instead of making decisions. You know, these characters are just kind of like flowing out of my fingertips. They're just kind of becoming instead of just, you know, I'm not making conscious decisions. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in scenes where Saoirse and Will are in the same room talking to one another, where these scenes were one take, and they just came super natural and didn't almost require any editing whatsoever. For the whole writing experience, it's like, for me, it's the camaraderie. There are so many good unpublished writers out there who are just looking to find friends, looking to find people who want to bounce a viewpoint, who want to ask questions, who want to share snippets. And there are so many published writers, which is the thing that surprised me, who are looking to help them. A lot of my encouragement, a lot of my inspiration comes from other writers, and most of them won't ever get published. Many of them don't ever care to be published. And even so, they really push me to be the best version of myself that I can be. There are two writers in particular that I really hope one day do get published, whether it's the avant-garde nature of their prose that inspires me every time I read it, or the dialogue first approach to all of their character relationships, their robust, intertwined relationships that just feel real. That kind of stuff gives me life, you know? And like, outside of like wargaming, I've never really seen the people who are on like the upper echelons of things interact so helpfully and respectfully with the people who are on the bottom. So like experiencing all that again through a different lens was just absolutely a joy. I think that one of the worst parts of writing the book was right after you told me about one of the other novels that didn't really make it. Like, one of the things you mentioned about it was there was a specific thing about how this person had invented some things about the setting. And I just was like anchored to my seat, just sweating, freaking out that I invented an entire township. I have all these characters, there's these events. And like, it took me like hours and multiple attempts for my writing group to like get me unstuck out of my head that I was making this like terrible mistake by daring to write a book about the things that you'd asked me to write a book about. Like, more seriously, I think it was probably like the month or two before getting the outline accepted and receiving the notes on it, like while everything was still with Goodyear with CB, because like, I'm the kind of person who, when something isn't in my control, I just kind of invent the worst case scenario and then walk around pretending that it's true. And I was so sure that Goodyear was going to send it back and just say no. So getting that email from you was basically just like the biggest relief.
Well, and hopefully a lot of those fears have been allayed, because as you've seen through this editing process, you know, I'm very happy with your work. A lot of the from what I can hear from your alpha readers, a lot of the comments were really positive, and Gouttiere was very fond of your second synopsis, which I'm teasing and not telling anything else about. So I'm hoping that a lot of those fears will be allayed as people are listening to this, and you, I'm sure, have countless 5-star reviews already on Amazon.
Here's hoping. Here's really, really hoping. I've got one 5-star review on Goodreads as of this exact moment, which I'm very proud of and reread on occasion in order to give myself some encouragement. So hopefully there's, like you said, about 5,000 more by the time this actually airs.
Well, before we sign off, it's tradition with these interviews to do 10 quick-fire questions. These are this or this. You don't have to give any explanation. Luckily, before the smoke grenade took Mark's place, I was able to get his 5 questions. So I'm going to alternate my question, Mark question. And here we go. Marvel or Star Wars?
Marvel.
Follow-up. Favorite character?
Spider-Man.
Wargaming, set up first or take the first turn?
First turn.
What do you prefer more, painting minis or playing the actual game?
Painting.
Well-painted minis, are they lucky or unlucky?
Lucky.
Which do you prefer, campaigns or single battles?
Single battles.
Star Wars trilogy, rank them best to worst.
Remember,
this is an opinion, but there are wrong answers.
Opinion. Original, prequel, sequel.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that one. Narrative battles or just for fun?
Narrative battles.
Plastic, resin, or metal minis?
Metal.
What do you prefer in novels, horror or comedy?
Horror.
All right, this is a Mark question, and I don't know if he's being silly or not, but he said, who'd win in a fight between John Rambo and John Matrix?
John Matrix.
I think he means Neo. That's why I don't know if it's that British humor or if he actually... I'm going to reword this question to say, who'd win in a fight between John Rambo and Neo?
I think it would be Neo, because John Rambo doesn't want the fight. He wouldn't take first blood.
Nice. All right. Well, that is all that we have for you on the Quickfire. John, it's been a great pleasure having you on the show to talk about the novel, something that Mark and I have both been looking forward to doing and we've talked about We've talked about you and name dropped you multiple times on the show, and I know Mark fully enjoyed speaking with you on the first half.
Thank you very, very much for having me and hearing that. Yeah, that's another thing I can put in my pockets for inspiration later. You guys have been super, super cool throughout this entire process. I just want to make sure that you know that I appreciate everything that you do. You have been completely awesome, and Mark has been awesome, both in completely different ways. And I'm very lucky to have you both.
I'll talk for the smoke grenade and say, "Oh, gee, thank you, mate. I really appreciate hearing that."
Thank you for the accent. That was perfect. It's like he's here with us right now.
Yeah, here in spirit on that smoke grenade. Listen, if you've liked what you've heard today, or you can find Airaghardt on Amazon, our website, WHPSupplyRoom.com, Barnes & Noble, any major book retailer. If you really want to help us, go ask your local bookstore to stock our books. Ask them to order it and buy it directly from them. It'll hopefully allow them to stock the book and give more visibility so other people can find the book. We've had success with a few Kings of War books. People went to their local bookstore, asked them to order it, bought a book, and they put it on the shelves. So you can help us out that way. We are distributed by Simon & Schuster, so they can order, any bookstore can order directly from them or from us. We will be happy to help out in any way possible. John, do you want to give any shout-outs before the end of the show?
Want to give a shout-out to the Arizona Infinity community and all the people who table me and beat up my models and put me in Lost Lieutenant on a regular basis. You guys are amazing, and there's nobody I would rather roll 2 20s on a PH-19 smoke grenade with than all of you. So Tim, Dylan, Matt, Kip, Tom, everybody, thank you so much. And especially Willett. Thank you so much for getting me the cover. It is so beautiful. I'm so happy to have it.
John, thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. I've been Brandon Rossbaum. I've been Mark Barber.
And I've been John Leibee.
We'll see you guys in the next episode.